Sam, there's something I want to tell you. I'm thinking about moving.
Oh yeah, where to?
To Faribault.
Oh, cool, that's great. I'll have my best friend nearby.
Packing up my
use it to
sunscreen.
work on stuff.
Learning Spanish. It's gonna be great. Yeah.
I'm sorry, what?
Oh, I wasn't clear. I'm moving to the city of Faribault in Venezuela.
I'm Sam Temple.
I'm Logan Ledman. Today, we'll be revealing the bizarre story of the Orinoco Company and the foundation of a Venezuelan settlement named Faribault.
This is Faribault, Minnesota. Faribault is a growing city in southern Minnesota. Logan and I have been exploring and sharing Faribault's history for the last 5 years. The Orinoco Company has by far the most bizarre and most international story we've documented to date.
If you went to Venezuela today, there'd be no remnants of anything Faribault, save for the hidden ruins of a hotel now overtaken by a century of time.
Our story begins with the complicated geopolitical history of South America, tracing back to when white colonizers originally set foot in the New World, nearly immediately taking advantage of indigenous people and exploiting the land for the sake of imperial expansion. Needless to say, this history is complicated and deeply personal. By the time Faribault entered the narrative in about a minute, the Spanish colony of Venezuela had been its own nation for just 50 years.
Venezuela was desperate to build its own wealth, struggling to retain autonomy after years of forced colonialism. That's where a man named Cyrenius Charles Fitzgerald comes in. A New York businessman, Cyrenius was granted 15 million acres of land in Venezuela in 1883.
The Venezuelan president, Joaquin Crespo, hoped that the move would help foster the U.S.'s interest in developing the country. This was especially pressing for Crespo because the British were itching for some colonizing again and were eyeing up South America.
By 1895, Cyrenius was interested in rebranding after several of his previous attempts to develop his land failed miserably. He started another company, the Orinoco Company. This new company was named for the vital river which connects much of Venezuela, the Orinoco. When the Orinoco Company was organized, one of its leaders was no New York City or San Francisco yuppie. In fact, it was Faribault's own Donald Grant.
Donald Grant was very rich. It is debatable whether this wealth was a result of, or resulted in, his major eccentricities. By pushing his laborers to their limit, Grant was known as the fastest railroad builder in the nation.
Donald Grant is responsible for a good portion of the rail across Minnesota, practically drawing out where communities would be centered and how economic prosperity would be distributed across the state.
Donald Grant started out as a poor immigrant from Canada and led an unstable life, moving around as a result of economic failings and health concerns. He didn't find sustained professional success until moving to Faribault. Here, he started railroad contracts. Through thousands of miles of rails, Grant connected Minnesota to the economies of different states and nations.
This success made him a larger-than-life figure in Faribault, figuratively and literally, because he was a broad, tall man with a big beard. The Opera House of Faribault, which is today the Paradise Center for the Arts, the canning works, driving park, and the boot and shoe manufactory were among the enterprises which Grant had substantially promoted. He was a director of the Citizens National Bank of Faribault and was also president of 2 banking institutions in South Dakota. In case you missed it, he was in leadership at some of Faribault's biggest employers and cultural hubs.
The name recognition and history of success made Donald Grant well liked by local leadership. In 1892 and 1893, he was unanimously nominated and served as Mayor of Faribault. Never outwardly seeking office himself, he nevertheless received the support of Democrats and Republicans. It can be easy to see how the conqueror's ego may have been the teeniest bit inflated by the momentum of his victories.
Donald Grant was the Orinoco Company's chief architect and leading investor when he invited several fellow Faribault citizens along with him to check out the company's land in 1895. At Caracas, Venezuela, the company was officially organized and valued at around $1 billion in today's money. Everyone involved was incredibly enthusiastic about the potential to harvest profit from the land around the Orinoco River.
The idea of building an economic boomtown along the river was a familiar one to the Faribault investors. Their own community was centered here, around the confluence of the Strait and Cannon rivers, and had quickly developed all the industries of modernity. The new settlement would similarly be rife with activity, from agriculture to quarrying, from transportation to milling. These were the industries which built up the Faribault settlement in Minnesota, and they would be what built up the Faribault settlement on the Orinoco land. In many ways, it must have felt like they were following the destiny of the generation before in creating their own Faribault.
The investors were quickly cheered by the discovery of high iron content ore near the river. A lucrative find. Another lucrative find was that this land was not in America. In fact, it fell under the jurisdiction of a privately owned company. This would allow the company to entirely set its own standards for working conditions, employee expectations, and wages for the Venezuelan workers.
To entice Americans to come live on the land, the company put out a sweet offer: 40 acres for free, along with 40 neighboring acres at bargain prices. The unspoken truth of the matter was this: anyone from Faribault with enough money to buy land in Venezuela would have been white. The laborers in Venezuela were not. Again, this is another upper hand the Faribault investors would have taken into account. With all these selling points in mind, delegations returned home to Faribault to recruit would-be colonists.
There was a problem as Americans started probing Venezuela for profiteering opportunities. The British had started probing Venezuela for profiteering opportunities. And with the excitement surrounding the Orinoco Company, the pressure was on for the U.S. government to protect American interests in the region.
For example, Minnesota's senior U.S. Senator Cushman Kellogg Davis had a vested interest in the developments of the Orinoco region by October of 1895, and was allegedly a stockholder in the company himself. Cushman, who used to be governor of Minnesota, was all for expansionist imperialism, and with the Orinoco situation developing, he had his eye on a run for the presidency in 1896.
After a statement from then-President Cleveland declaring that the Venezuela situation needed to be resolved, Cushman made his move, proposing a law that would make it illegal for any European country to claim territory in the entire Western Hemisphere by purchase, concession, or any other means.
Though the bill was a bold move that signaled the U.S.'s growing interest in dominating the rest of the Western Hemisphere, and would likely have initiated a war with Britain and much of Europe, it didn't pass. In the resulting humiliation, Cushman was forced to publicly deny any involvement in the Orinoco Company that might have influenced his decision to propose the bill.
But in the fierce debates and anger about British involvement in South America, talk was growing of war. Eventually, the British colonial secretary felt pressured to declare that discussions of war between Britain and the United States were absurd, and that any disputes about British claims in Venezuela could be peacefully solved in arbitration.
And so the Orinoco Company narrowly dodged being involved in the potential birth of an alternate universe's World War I. They were simply thrilled that the U.S. government had their back, with such a hardline stance in defense of the company's interest. Cyrenius Charles Fitzgerald himself began discussing a future for Venezuela that involved living under the American flag.
By June of 1896, the company had drawn about 250 workers to the land. from University of Minnesota scientists to blacksmiths and miners. There were sacrifices, of course. The project head, A.C. Rogers, must have been heartbroken to report that since he and his fellow whites were having such trouble adjusting to the climate, they would have to let native Venezuelan workers do much of the hardest work. Wah wah.
As the company grew, in February of 1897, a notable boatload took off from New York Harbor, filled with dreams of Venezuela. The passengers, mostly citizens of a small town in Minnesota, had a specific goal: the creation of a new town, Faribault, Venezuela.
Unfortunately for the prospective pilgrims, their travel experience was less than exemplary. The boat ride was overly long for their tastes and tormented by storms. The food on board was unusually garlicky, and the company grew tiresome. For example, it seems a judge named Baxter spent hours reciting passages from the works of Shakespeare and John Milton with his garlic breath, much to the chagrin of his captive audience.
In March, the colonists arrived in Venezuela, along the land belonging to the Orinoco Company. Envisioning a prosperous, sweet little city, they had planned on putting together the two basics of small-town life: the church and the schoolhouse.
Instead, they built a hotel, but they initially loved their new home. The hotel was designed by Faribault's own Olaf Hansen. Letters sent back to Faribault describe a tropical paradise full of easy hunting and mosquitoes tamer than the ones around Minnesotan lakes. A miracle.
In 1897, mild development had occurred, but many Faribaultians had less interest in building a community and more interest in taking souvenirs. Donald Grant's own son, Sam, brought to Faribault a pack of assorted birds, along with 2 people from Trinidad he had met along the way. The birds were soon dead, and the people from Trinidad have disappeared from the historical record.
Not just Grant's son, but also his cousin, William, had left Orinoco. William had brought home a talking parrot and a monkey. To show off how much progress was being made, a couple pieces of gold were placed in the Faribault Opera House lobby. Not much progress was being made other than showing off knickknacks from a very expensive vacation.
Seeing the writing on the wall, Donald Grant began selling off and leasing bits and pieces of the Orinoco Company. Meanwhile, Joaquin Crespo stepped away from the presidency, retiring to the simple life. The simple life of a military dictator, shortly thereafter dying in an 1898 revolutionary battle, indicating once again the fall into political chaos which would dog Venezuela for most of its history. You know, the simple life.
That's when things just started to get crazy. Within the next year, as uncertain anarchy loomed over Venezuela and the Orinoco Company, the Faribault Orinoco folks gave up controlling interest in the company to a ragtag team of incredibly wealthy New York and London investors. Luckily, they gave the Faribaultians a firm promise that they would still get to have an active role in running things.
That's when Castro stepped in. Cipriano Castro, an exiled military leader and former governor. He had spent the last few years hanging out, practicing self-care, and amassing a private army with the goal of taking control of Venezuela. With no real government in the wake of our friend Joaquin's death, Castro had the perfect opportunity to step in and take hold of power.
As Castro took power in 1899, the American foreigners living on the Orinoco land began wondering what their place in a new Venezuela would look like.
Castro immediately ordered that all foreigners would be expelled and that the Orinoco deal was canceled.
This was not good news. Luckily, Judge Baxter, the Shakespeare fan from the boat, had stuck around with the company through all these years, presumably because not everybody had yet heard his Othello. Clearly, the judge was a legal expert, because he stated that everybody could just ignore Castro's order and keep up the good work. The show must go on.
As tensions grew in Venezuela, the U.S. wanted to get in on the whole violent overthrow of an unstable government thing. President William McKinley ordered 2 Navy ships and a gunboat, which are 2 different things, to just hang out in Caracas Harbor, just in case fighting broke out.
The U.S. was not the only nation rearing to fight. Germany was owed quite a bit of money from Venezuela. Castro formally revoked the IOU, essentially telling Germany to suck it. Following this outrage from a former colony, nearly every European nation told Venezuela that it could also suck it, because they said its citizens could not be expelled from the country. So, ha!
As these nations were bracing for war across the whole world, a world war, if you will, the Minnesota State Fair was happening. Good times. It was such a good time that the Vice President of the United States was there, giving a speech declaring that if anyone was going to invade South America, the U.S. called dibs.
2 weeks after that speech, President William McKinley was shot and killed, making Vice President Theodore Roosevelt the head honcho, just in time for another splendid little war.
A few months into his presidency, Teddy received notice from England and Germany that they were planning a blockade of Venezuela. P.S. We might invade Venezuela for a little bit, but we promise we won't stay forever, build up a new empire in South America, and eventually crush your economy from the south. Pretty sure that's an exact quote.
Teddy took this with grace and started planning his own secret invasion of Venezuela. To protect it from the German invasion. Teddy began bulking up the Navy arsenal anchored in the Caribbean.
Tensions continued to grow over the next year. Teddy was emboldened after more experience, and it seemed the powder keg was about to explode.
Castro's power was on the verge of collapse, and he had no money, for which England and Germany demanded payment.
Teddy ordered the Caribbean fleet to be ready at a moment's notice for dispatch to Venezuela.
Finally, Germany began its assault and landed on Venezuela. Castro yielded immediately.
The crescendo seemed to build to nothing. The following month, a tribunal was established to foster peace, and the European blockade was lifted.
In this changing climate, the Orinoco Company was allowed to keep its land, but Venezuela was not happy about it. They sued and harassed the company. The company, in turn, tried to get Roosevelt to stand up for them, with little success.
Years after dreams of colonization first twinkled in the Faribault investors' eyes, they had almostly moved on to other things. For Donald Grant, he likely moved on to other and equally crazy things. It may have been a faint memory, a long-ago experience when, in 1907, news came that the land rights were finally denied to the Orinoco Company.
Venezuela's resistance paid off. The land was theirs again, effectively dissolving any semblance of what might have been the Faribault Venezuela colony.
A few months later, the U.S. ended diplomatic relations with Venezuela. The year was 1907, and the young nation's government was overthrown yet again.
Juan Vicente Gomez, at one time Castro's vice president, decided to take the top job for himself. He also decided that the Orinoco fight was not yet over. He agreed to argue the case before the International Court of Arbitration in 1909.
By 1911, the Orinoco Company finally declared bankruptcy. The fight was officially over. It's hard to say whether there really was a winner. The ambitious Faribaultians saw their potential rot in a jungle. England and Germany had to seek empire elsewhere, as did the United States. All three would have their fill of war in the coming decades, making conflicts like that over the Orinoco land seem trivial by comparison.
Venezuela continues to be unstable to this day, seemingly unable to break free from its past of being conquered by either invading nations or power-hungry dictators. President Gomez was believed to be the richest man in South America in his lifetime, making the nation's wealth his own and stifling the freedom of his people with authoritarian policies.
This story intersects with so many broad historical concepts, it's difficult to wrap this up neatly. This story deals with the hyper-capitalism of the Gilded Age, as well as the idea of manifest destiny extending American authority to the South. It deals with colonialism, subjugation of indigenous people, and our relationship with the past. Because history is so rarely a clean narrative, we must draw our own conclusions from the facts presented to us. The narrative we decide to pull from the record is a reflection of the teller and can tell us most effectively about the present.